I never thought it would take an accident for me to finally see the truth about my family. It wasn't a car crash, not a slip on a patch of ice, nothing that would leave a visible scar. It was a quieter kind of accident, an emotional pile-up that had been building for years, culminating in a moment of stark, unavoidable clarity in my own sun-drenched kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee, a dark French roast, filled the room, a familiar comfort that suddenly felt hollow. It was a Sunday. For 30 years, Sunday mornings in my house had been a symphony of controlled chaos. The sizzle of bacon in the pan, the whir of the mixer for pancake batter, the muffled sounds of the television from the living room where my husband, Tom, would have been watching the pre-game shows before he passed. Later, it was the sound of my children's voices, first as little ones demanding more syrup, then as teenagers grumbling about being woken up, and finally, as adults bringing their own children, filling the space with a new generation of laughter and demands. Now, there was only the sound of the old refrigerator humming, the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that used to mark the rhythm of our lives but now only seemed to count the seconds of my solitude. I sat at the heavy oak table, the one Tom and I had bought at a flea market when we were first married, its surface scarred with the history of our family, a burn mark from a misplaced pot, a series of nicks from a science project gone wrong, a faint ring from a glass of spilled milk that was never quite wiped away. I ran my hand over the familiar grooves, my fingers tracing a map of a life I no longer recognized as my own. Propped against the sugar bowl was an old photograph. It was from a family trip to the lake, maybe 15 years ago. I was in the middle, my hair a lighter shade of brown then, not yet surrendered to the silver that now framed my face. I had my arms around my two children, Sarah and Mark. Sarah, my eldest, was beaming, her braces glinting in the sun. Mark, ever the little trooper, was trying to look cool and grown up, but a smudge of chocolate on his cheek betrayed him. In the photo, we were a unit, a constellation of love and shared experience. My world revolved around them, and their smiles were the sun that warmed me. That woman in the photograph, the one with the easy smile and the arms wrapped protectively around her children, felt like a stranger to me now. A ghost from a past life. A blinking light on the answering machine caught my eye. I had let the call go to voicemail earlier, already knowing what it would be. I pressed the play button, and my daughter's voice, bright and professionally apologetic, filled the silent kitchen. "Hey, Mom. It's me. Listen, I'm so sorry, but I'm not going to be able to make it for dinner tonight. Things at work are just insane. We're trying to close this big deal, and my boss basically said it's all hands on deck this weekend. You know how it is. I feel terrible. Give the kids a hug for me. I'll try to call later in the week. Love you." The message ended with a cheerful beep. You know how it is. I did. I knew it all too well. It was the same excuse as last month, just with a different project name. The month before that, it was a friend's emergency baby shower that she just couldn't miss. With Mark, it was usually a last-minute trip with his buddies or the need to recharge after a tough week at his landscaping job. The excuses were a smokescreen, a flimsy veil over a truth that had been settling around me like fine dust for years. I had become an obligation. A box to be checked. Sunday dinner at Mom's. I picked up my coffee cup, the ceramic warm against my palms, and looked out the window. The street was quiet. Mrs. Henderson from across the way was watering her petunias, her movements slow and deliberate. A young couple jogged by, pushing a stroller, their laughter carrying on the still morning air. It was a typical suburban tableau, peaceful and orderly. But my house, once the vibrant center of my world, felt like a museum, a repository of memories that no one else had time to visit. The pang of betrayal was sharp and acidic, rising in my throat. It wasn't just about a missed dinner. It was about the slow, creeping erosion of my place in their lives. I was the constant, the ever-present, the one who would always be there. And in my reliability, I had become invisible. They had built their own lives, their own worlds, and I was no longer at the center of them. I was a satellite, orbiting their bright, Busy planets, my own light growing dimmer and dimmer. I hung up the phone, the click of the receiver echoing in the silence. That was it. That was the accident. Not the phone call itself, but the way it landed on my heart. It was the final piece of a puzzle I hadn't even realized I was solving. The picture it formed was one of profound, soul-crushing loneliness. I looked back at the photograph on the table. The smiling woman, the happy children. It was a beautiful memory. But it was just that, a memory. It wasn't my present. It wasn't my future. The love I felt for them hadn't changed, but the dynamics had shifted so fundamentally that the old ways of relating were no longer working. They were breaking me, one polite excuse at a time. A strange calm settled over me, pushing aside the initial sting of hurt. It was the calm of acceptance. Not resignation, but a clear-eyed understanding of the situation. Things had to change. And since my children were too busy living their lives to notice the toll it was taking on mine, the change would have to start with me. The woman in that photograph, the one who had given everything, deserved better. And I, the woman sitting alone in her quiet kitchen, was the only one left who could give it to her. The thought was both terrifying and electrifying. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something other than passive disappointment. It was a spark of intention. The Sunday symphony was over. It was time to compose a new piece, a solo for myself. The invisible chains weren't forged in a single day. They were woven over decades, strand by delicate strand, with threads of love, duty, and sacrifice. Looking back, I can see how each thread was willingly offered, a small piece of myself given freely in the service of building a family. I don't regret the love. I don't regret the devotion. But I never realized I was building my own cage. I remember when Sarah was in high school, struggling with chemistry. She'd come home in tears, convinced she was going to fail, that her dreams of becoming a veterinarian were dissolving like salt in a beaker. I spent weeks with her at this very kitchen table, night after night, poring over textbooks I barely understood. I learned about covalent bonds and atomic weights, my own long-forgotten hobbies, painting, reading novels that weren't assigned for a book report, gathering dust on a shelf in the back of my mind. When she finally passed her final exam with a B+, her relief was my victory. Her success was my fulfillment. I didn't think to ask for my time back. It was a gift. When Mark decided he wanted to start his own landscaping business right out of high school, Tom had been skeptical. He needs a business plan, Lynn. He needs experience. But Mark had a passion, a fire in his eyes that I couldn't bear to see extinguished by practicality. We had a nest egg, money we'd carefully saved for a trip to Italy we'd always dreamed of. He just needs a little help to get started, I had argued. We can go to Italy anytime. We used a significant portion of that fund to buy him a used truck and commercial-grade mowers. The business thrived, for a while. He was his own boss. He was happy. And that was enough for me. We never did get to Italy. Tom passed away 2 years later, and the dream of sipping wine under a Tuscan sun passed with him, replaced by the quiet hum of my son's success, which I told myself was a more lasting monument anyway. After Tom was gone, my role intensified. I became the sole anchor, the command center for a family that was growing and scattering. Sarah married a driven young lawyer named David, and soon came my grandchildren, Emily and Joshua. My house became the default daycare. "Mom, could you possibly watch the kids on Thursday? David and I have a work dinner," Sarah would ask, her voice already assuming the answer. "Of course," I would say. What else did I have to do? My days became a whirlwind of school pickups, soccer practices, and trips to the park. I loved it, I truly did. The feel of a small hand in mine, the sound of their giggles echoing in the rooms where my own children had grown up, it was a balm to my grief. But slowly, the requests became assumptions. The "could you possibly" turned into "I'll drop the kids off around 9. My own plans, a lunch with a friend or a quiet afternoon with a book, were always flexible, always secondary. I was the family's safety net, and I prided myself on it. I was needed. Mark's business hit a rough patch. A couple of bad winters, a few clients who paid late. The requests for loans started. First, it was a few $100s to cover payroll. Then $1,000 for an emergency repair on his truck. "I'll pay you back as soon as the next invoice clears, Mom. I swear," he'd say, his voice laced with a desperation that twisted my heart. He rarely did. The subject would be studiously avoided, a small, awkward silence in our conversations until I mentally wrote it off, another gift to keep his dream afloat. I was enabling him, I see that now. But at the time, I saw it as a mother's duty. You don't let your children fail if you have the power to prevent it. The dynamic became set in stone. I was the giver. I gave time, I gave energy, I gave money. They were the takers. They took it with love, with thanks, with casual entitlement. They weren't malicious. They were just living the lives I had helped them build, blind to the fact that the foundation was beginning to crumble. My own life had been hollowed out, the space filled entirely by their needs. I was Lynn, the mother, the grandmother. The I that was just Lynn, the woman with her own thoughts and desires, had faded into a pale, translucent version of herself. I remember a specific moment a year or so ago. It was my birthday. They had all come over for a celebratory dinner, one I had cooked, of course. Sarah had brought a lovely cake from a fancy bakery, and the grandchildren had made me clumsy, beautiful cards. They sang happy birthday, and I blew out the 64 candles, my lungs aching slightly. As I cut the cake, the conversation swirled around me. Sarah was talking about a stressful work presentation. David was complaining about the stock market. Mark was lamenting the cost of equipment. They were all there, physically present in my dining room, but their minds were elsewhere. They were talking at each other, not to each other, and certainly not to me. I sat at the head of the table, serving cake, a silent spectator at my own party. After they had all left, leaving a mountain of dishes in their wake, I sat in the living room, the quiet pressing in on me. I realized that not one of them had asked me a single question about myself. Not "How are you feeling, Mom?" Not "What do you want to do for your birthday, besides cook for us?" Not "Do you have any plans for the coming year?" My birthday had been about them. It was an occasion for them to gather and perform the ritual of family, with me as the benevolent, silent prop. That was the day I first felt the cold weight of the chains. They weren't made of steel, but of expectation. The expectation that I would always be available, always be accommodating, always be the one to smooth things over, to absorb the stress, to provide the comfort. And the heaviest chain of all was my own silence, my unwillingness to say, "What about me?" I had so completely sublimated my own needs that I had forgotten how to even articulate them. The thought of doing so felt selfish, demanding, unnatural. It was the role I had chosen, the identity I had crafted. To complain about it felt like a betrayal of the loving mother I had always strived to be. So I polished the chains. I kept them gleaming with my compliance. Until that Sunday morning, when Sarah's breezy voicemail acted as a solvent, dissolving the years of self-deception. As I looked at my checkbook, at the latest entry a few weeks back, loan to Mark, truck repair, I didn't feel the familiar pang of maternal concern. For the first time, I felt a hot flash of anger. It wasn't a loan, it was a tax. A tax on being a mother. And the invisible chains suddenly felt cold, hard, and impossibly heavy. They were cutting into my skin, and I knew, with a certainty that shook me to my core, that I had to break them. The drive to my sister's house was a blur of familiar suburban streets that suddenly looked foreign. The tidy lawns, the two-car garages, the basketball hoops standing sentinel in the driveways. It was the landscape of my entire adult life, but I was seeing it through a new lens. It all looked like a stage set, designed for a play in which I had been miscast. My sister, Claire, lived about 20 minutes away in a small condominium complex that catered to active seniors, a phrase she despised. "It makes us sound like a science experiment, Lynn," she'd say with a wry smile. Claire was my opposite in many ways. While I had married my high school sweetheart and settled into domesticity, she had pursued a career as a librarian, had a few passionate but short-lived romances, and had never had children. She was 2 years older than me, and her independence had always been something I'd admired from a distance, like a beautiful, exotic country I would never have the courage to visit. Her condo was small but vibrant. Bookshelves overflowed, spilling their contents onto side tables and chairs. Colorful textiles from her travels were draped over the furniture, and the walls were covered in art, not expensive pieces, but prints and paintings that spoke to her. The air smelled of old paper and lemon tea. It was a space that was unapologetically hers. She opened the door before I had a chance to ring the bell. "I saw you pull in," she said, her sharp blue eyes taking in my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," I said, stepping inside. "The ghost of my future." She ushered me toward a comfortable armchair and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. "That sounds dramatic, even for you. What have Sarah and Mark done now?" There was no judgment in her voice, only a weary familiarity. Claire had always been an observer of my family life, a loving but clear-eyed aunt who saw the dynamics more clearly than I ever could. As the water heated, I told her everything. About the phone call from Sarah. The endless loans to Mark. The birthday party where I had felt like a piece of furniture. The words tumbled out of me, a torrent of frustration and hurt that I had kept dammed up for years. I confessed my anger, and then, my guilt over feeling that anger. Claire listened patiently, her head tilted, her gaze never leaving my face. When I finally ran out of steam, my voice raspy with emotion, she handed me a steaming mug of tea. "Well," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "It's about time." "What do you mean?" I asked, taken aback. "Lynn, I love you, but you've been a doormat for 30 years, she said, her tone gentle but firm. "You've taught them that your time, your energy, and your money are a limitless public utility. Of course they take you for granted. You've never given them a reason not to." Her words were blunt, but they didn't sting. They resonated with the truth that had been dawning on me all morning. "But they're my children," I whispered, the old excuse sounding feeble even to my own ears. "I love them." "Nobody is questioning that," Claire said. "Loving them and letting them drain you dry are two different things. You know, I had to do this with my own friends, my own family, years ago." I looked at her, surprised. Claire always seemed so self-sufficient, so immune to the pressures of obligation. "Oh, yes," she continued, a reminiscent smile on her lips. "When Mom and Dad were still alive, I was the unmarried daughter. The one who was always free to run their errands, to take them to doctor's appointments. My siblings, with their own families, were always too busy. I was just Claire. It took me getting pneumonia to finally put my foot down." "Pneumonia?" "Yep. I was sick as a dog, flat on my back for 2 weeks. And the phone just kept ringing. 'Claire, could you just look up this number for me?' 'Claire, the pharmacy said Dad's prescription is ready, could you?' I finally snapped. I unplugged the phone. For a whole week. It was the most peaceful week of my life." She took a sip of her tea. "When I finally plugged it back in, the sky hadn't fallen. The world had kept spinning. But something had changed. I had changed. I started saying no. Just a simple, 2-letter word. No, I can't do that today. No, that doesn't work for me. It was terrifying at first. I felt so guilty. But a funny thing happened. They started respecting my time. They had to, because I was respecting it first. A seed of an idea, small but potent, began to germinate in the fertile ground of my newfound awareness. Saying no, I murmured. It sounded so simple, yet so revolutionary. "It's not about punishing them, Lynn," Claire said, leaning forward. "It's about teaching them. It's about setting boundaries. A boundary isn't a wall to keep people out. It's a fence that says, this is my property. This is where I live. You are welcome to visit, but you have to respect the space." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the ticking of a small carriage clock on her mantel. I looked around her room, at the evidence of a life lived for herself. The books she had read, the art she enjoyed, the mementos of places she had been. My house was a museum to my family. Hers was a gallery of her soul. I don't know how, I finally admitted, my voice small. I've spent my whole life saying yes. It's like my mouth doesn't know how to form the word no when it comes to them. Then start small, she advised. You don't have to climb Mount Everest tomorrow. Just take the first step. Find one small thing, one routine that is draining you, and just stop doing it. See what happens. I thought of the Sunday dinners. The hours of planning, shopping, cooking, and cleaning. The expectation. The inevitable last-minute cancellations. It was the perfect symbol of my servitude. Leaving Claire's house, I felt a shift in my internal landscape. The fog of hurt and confusion was beginning to lift, replaced by a fragile, tentative clarity. I wasn't leaving with a detailed battle plan. I was leaving with a single word. A key. No. As I drove home, I looked at my own front door, the same door I had walked through thousands of times. But today, it looked different. It looked like a starting line. The conversation with Claire had done more than just offer advice, it had given me permission. Permission to consider my own needs, to value my own well-being. The seed had been planted, and for the first time, I felt the desire to see what it might grow into. The days that followed my visit with Claire were a silent battlefield waged entirely within the confines of my own mind. The simple, two-letter word she had gifted me, no, felt like a foreign object in my mouth, heavy and misshapen. Years of conditioning, decades of defining my worth by my willingness to give, had created deep grooves in my psyche, and steering myself out of them felt like trying to turn a battleship in a bathtub. My first test came on Wednesday. Mark called, his voice a familiar blend of casual charm and underlying urgency. Hey, Mom. Quick question. You know that big commercial job I landed out in Northwood? The client is being a real pain about the payout. I'm a little short for payroll on Friday. Could you spot me $1,500? Just till next week. I'm good for it, you know I am. The old, automatic response was already forming on my tongue, of course, sweetie. I'll transfer it this afternoon. My hand even twitched toward the drawer where I kept my checkbook. It was muscle memory. The instinct to soothe, to fix, to provide, was as involuntary as breathing. But Claire's voice echoed in my head. You've taught them that your time and money are a limitless public utility. I took a breath. My heart hammered against my ribs. It felt like I was about to jump off a cliff. Mark, I began, my voice sounding thin and reedy to my own ears. I can't this time. Silence. The line crackled. For a moment, I thought he had hung up. What? Did you say you can't? He sounded genuinely baffled, as if I'd just started speaking in Swahili. That's right, I said, forcing a little more strength into my tone. My finances are a bit tight right now. I'm not able to make any more loans. It was a lie, of course. My finances were fine. But I couldn't bring myself to say the blunter truth, no, because I'm done being your personal ATM. The lie was a crutch, a way to soften the blow. Oh, he said. The single word was laden with confusion and a faint, wounded tone. Okay. Well, I'll figure something out then. I guess. I'm sure you will, Mark. You're very resourceful, I said, and the words felt true. He was a grown man, a business owner. It was time for him to be resourceful with his own resources, not mine. The conversation ended quickly after that, a cloud of awkwardness hanging between us. When I put the phone down, my hand was trembling. I felt a dizzying cocktail of emotions. There was a surge of adrenaline, a flutter of panic, and a deep, churning guilt that felt like I had swallowed a stone. I had said no to my son. I had let him down. A voice in my head, the one that sounded suspiciously like the mother I had always been, screamed that I was being cruel, selfish, cold. But beneath the guilt, there was something else. A small, unfamiliar flicker of empowerment. I had stood my ground. I had protected my fence. The bigger test, I knew, was yet to come. The weekend loomed, and with it, the specter of Sunday dinner. On Thursday evening, Sarah called. Hey, Mom, she said, her voice brisk. Just firming up the weekend plans. David's parents are in town, and we thought we'd all come over for dinner on Sunday. Around 5? That way it's not too late for the kids. I'll bring a dessert." She said it so casually, a simple statement of fact. "We're coming over." Not, "Would it be alright if we came over?" Not, "Are you up for having company?" My throat went dry. This was it. The main event. "Actually, Sarah, that's not going to work for me," I said. I tried to sound as breezy as she did. A pause. "Oh. Is everything okay? You're not sick, are you?" Her concern was immediate, but I recognized it for what it was, a search for a problem that could be easily solved. Sickness was a legitimate excuse. A simple change of heart was not. "No, I'm not sick. I'm fine. I've just decided to take a break from hosting the big Sunday dinners for a while." My voice didn't shake this time. It was steadier. "A break?" She sounded as bewildered as Mark had. "What do you mean, a break? We always have dinner at your place on Sundays." "I know," I said. "And it's been wonderful. But it's a lot of work, and I'm going to be using my Sundays for other things from now on." "Other things? What other things?" The question wasn't born of genuine curiosity. It was an interrogation. A demand for a justification she deemed valid. Here was the moment of truth. I could invent another lie, a prior commitment, a new class I was taking. But I was tired of lies. I was tired of softening the truth to manage their feelings. "Just things for me," I said simply. "My own things." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and freighted with disapproval. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head as she tried to process this unprecedented act of maternal rebellion. "Well," she finally said, her voice distinctly cooler. "That's unexpected. I don't know what to tell David's parents." "Tell them the truth," I suggested gently. "That your mother is taking the day for herself. I'm sure they'll understand. Perhaps you could take everyone out to a restaurant? Or you could host them at your house." The unspoken implication hung in the air. "You could cook for them." "Right," she said, her voice tight. "Well, I have to go. I'll talk to you later." She hung up without saying "I love you." The click of the phone this time felt like a door slamming shut. The guilt came roaring back, 10 times stronger than before. I had disappointed both my children in the space of 2 days. I had disrupted the family rhythm. I had been selfish. I sank into a kitchen chair, my head in my hands, the silence of the house pressing down on me. What if they stopped calling altogether? What if, in trying to reclaim a piece of myself, I lost them completely? The fear was a cold, physical presence in the room. But as I sat there, stewing in my own anxiety, a different thought began to surface, pushing through the weeds of fear and guilt. It was the memory of Sarah's voice, her genuine shock that I might have other things to do. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. In her mind, I didn't have a life outside of her and her family. My existence was defined solely by my utility to them. My other things were so inconceivable that they didn't even warrant a real question. That thought, more than anything, ignited a spark of anger. Not a hot, raging fire, but a slow, steady burn. It was the anger of injustice. The anger of being erased. And it was that anger that finally gave me the strength to push back against the tide of guilt. They weren't angry because I had hurt them. They were angry because I had inconvenienced them. They were angry because the limitless public utility had suddenly shut off the power. And maybe, just maybe, a blackout was exactly what they needed to finally see the woman who had been paying the bill all along. That Sunday was the first Sunday in 3 decades that I did not plan my day around a family meal. I woke up with a knot of anxiety in my stomach, a phantom guilt for a crime I was about to commit, the crime of putting myself first. The silence in the house felt different, not peaceful, but charged, like the air before a storm. I kept expecting the phone to ring, for Sarah or Mark to call, either in anger or with a change of heart. But the phone remained silent. Instead of heading to the grocery store with a long list, I made myself a single cup of coffee and a piece of toast with marmalade. I ate it slowly, sitting at the kitchen table, feeling like a tourist in my own life. The hours stretched before me, a vast, unstructured expanse. It was terrifying. My days had always had a purpose, a clear set of tasks centered on the care of others. Without that, who was I? What was I supposed to do? Claire's voice came back to me. Start small. So I did. I walked out into my backyard. It was a pleasant space, but one I had always treated with utilitarian purpose. A neat lawn for the grandkids to play on, a few hardy, low-maintenance shrubs, a small, neglected vegetable patch that produced a few sad-looking tomatoes each year. I had never seen it as a place of joy, only as another chore. But this morning, I looked at it differently. I saw the way the morning light filtered through the leaves of the old maple tree. I noticed a tenacious little rosebush in the corner that, despite my neglect, had produced a single, perfect crimson bloom. I walked over and touched its velvety petals, inhaling its faint, sweet scent. It was a small act of defiance, a tiny bloom of beauty in a world of obligation. On impulse, I drove to the local garden center. It was a place I usually rushed through, grabbing bags of mulch or pest spray. Today, I wandered. I let myself be drawn to the vibrant colors of the annuals, the exotic shapes of the perennials. I read the little plastic tags, learning the names of flowers I had never noticed before: lantana, verbena, salvia. I wasn't shopping for curb appeal. I was shopping for delight. I bought a pair of sturdy gardening gloves, a trowel, and 3 flats of flowers that caught my eye: brilliant purple petunias, sunny yellow marigolds, and delicate blue lobelia. I had no plan, no landscape design in mind. I was just following an impulse. Back home, I changed into my oldest jeans and a faded t-shirt. I knelt in the dirt of a long-neglected flower bed along the side of the house, the one that got the best afternoon sun. The earth was cool and damp in my hands. I pulled out weeds, my movements awkward at first, then more confident. I dug small holes and settled the new plants into them, patting the soil around their roots. It was hard work. My back started to ache. My knees protested. But something incredible was happening. As my hands got dirtier, my mind got clearer. The rhythm of the work, dig, place, pat, repeat, was meditative. The knot of anxiety in my stomach began to loosen. The angry, guilty voices in my head grew quieter, replaced by the simple, tactile reality of the task at hand. I wasn't mom or grandma in that moment. I was just a woman, kneeling in the sun, making something beautiful for no one's pleasure but my own. I worked for hours, losing all track of time. By late afternoon, the once barren patch was a riot of color. It was a small thing, a single strip of earth, but it felt like a monumental achievement. I had taken a piece of my world and transformed it, not out of duty, but out of desire. Feeling a satisfying ache in my muscles, I went inside and made myself a simple sandwich for dinner. I ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at my handiwork. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow on the new flowers. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. It wasn't just relief from the guilt. It was the relief of liberation. I had survived the day. The world hadn't ended. I had filled the terrifying, empty hours with something that nourished my own soul. The freedom was intoxicating. The silence of the house no longer felt like a void, but like a space that was mine to fill. I had spent the day creating, not catering. I had tended to my own garden, literally and metaphorically. As dusk settled, I sat on my back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the fireflies begin to blink in the twilight. The house was quiet. The phone had not rung. The initial guilt I'd felt that morning had been baked out of me by the sun and kneaded out by the work. It was replaced by a quiet, fierce satisfaction. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know how the confrontation with my children would ultimately play out. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt a sense of peace. It was the peace of knowing that I had taken the first, crucial step away from the person everyone expected me to be, and toward the person I wanted to become. The path ahead was uncertain, but as I looked at my small, colorful patch of rebellion, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was finally heading in the right direction. The backlash, when it came, was not a sudden explosion but a cold front, a palpable drop in the emotional temperature of my family. The silent, empty space I had begun to cherish was soon filled with the static of disapproval. It started with Mark. He called on Tuesday, and the easy charm was gone from his voice, replaced by a brittle, defensive edge. "So," he began, without any preamble, "I had to borrow money from a friend to make payroll. It was embarrassing." The accusation was clear: "This is your fault." The old me would have crumbled, apologizing profusely and offering to immediately correct my mistake by transferring the funds. The new me took a slow, deliberate breath. "I'm sorry it was an embarrassing situation for you, Mark," I said, my voice even. "But you're a business owner. Managing cash flow is part of the job." "It would be easier to manage if I had the family support I thought I had," he shot back, his voice rising. "You have my love and support in 1,000 different ways, Mark," I said, a new firmness in my tone surprising even myself. "But my bank account is no longer one of them. That's a boundary I've had to set for my own well-being." "Boundary?" He spat the word out like it was something foul. "Since when do you talk like that? It sounds like something you read in a self-help book. What's gotten into you, Mom? You're being selfish." Selfish. There it was. The word I had been dreading my entire life. The ultimate condemnation for a mother. For a moment, it landed like a punch to the gut, stealing my breath. The guilt surged, hot and familiar. But then, something else rose up to meet it. That slow-burning anger. "Maybe I am being selfish," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "Maybe after 64 years of putting everyone else first, I've earned the right to be a little selfish. Maybe what you call selfish, I call self-preservation." He was silent for a long moment. I could hear his frustrated sigh through the phone. "I don't get it," he finally said, his voice dropping to a sullen grumble. "I just don't get you anymore." "Maybe you're finally getting to know the real me, not just the me who writes the checks," I replied. The conversation ended soon after, not with a resolution, but with a tense, unhappy stalemate. Sarah's approach was different, more strategic. She tried manipulation disguised as concern. She showed up at my door unannounced on Thursday afternoon, a pot of orchids in her hand. "I was worried about you," she said, sweeping past me into the kitchen. "You've been acting so strange lately. First the thing with Mark's loan, then canceling Sunday dinner. It's not like you. Are you lonely? Are you feeling depressed?" She was trying to pathologize my behavior, to frame it as a symptom of a problem, loneliness, depression, that she could then manage and solve, restoring the old order. If I was sick, I could be cured. "I'm not depressed, Sarah. I'm content," I said, leaning against the counter and folding my arms. "And I'm not lonely. I'm enjoying my own company." She placed the orchids on the table, a floral peace offering that felt more like a prop. "But we're your family. You're supposed to want to be with us. The kids miss their grandma. Josh asked me why we couldn't go to Grandma's house for pancakes." The mention of my grandchildren was a calculated blow, aimed directly at my weakest point. A pang of genuine hurt shot through me. "I adored those children and I miss them too," I said, my voice softening for a moment. "But my relationship with my grandchildren shouldn't be conditional on me providing a free restaurant and daycare service every single Sunday. My love for them isn't measured in pancakes, Sarah. You and David are their parents. It's your job to make sure they have a good weekend. It's no longer my full-time responsibility." Her face tightened. The mask of concern slipped, revealing raw frustration. "I can't believe this," she said, shaking her head. "After everything we've been through, after Dad passed. I thought we were a team. I thought we could count on you. Instead, you're off. What? Gardening? It's just so bizarre. You're abandoning your family." Abandoning. Another loaded word. Selfish. Abandoning. They were building a case against me, casting me as the villain in a story where I had always been the quiet, dependable heroine. The emotional toll was immense. After Sarah left, Slamming the door just a little too hard, I felt utterly drained, as if I'd run a marathon. The old me would have been in tears, already reaching for the phone to apologize, to smooth things over, to surrender. But as I stood in my silent kitchen, I felt a strange and unfamiliar resilience taking root in my soul. It was a quiet strength, born not of anger, but of clarity. They didn't see me. They saw a role, a function, a service provider. They weren't mourning the loss of me, Lynn, the person. They were panicking at the loss of my services. Their love and concern were intertwined with their own convenience. And as painful as that realization was, it was also profoundly liberating. It severed the puppet strings of guilt. I knew standing my ground would be hard. I hadn't expected it to be this painful, to have my own children wield my love for them as a weapon against me. But in their pushback, they were inadvertently giving me a gift. They were showing me the true nature of the chains that had bound me. And with every accusation they threw at me, my resolve to break free grew stronger. I looked in the mirror over the mantelpiece. My face was etched with fatigue. There were new lines around my eyes. But my eyes themselves were different. They were clearer. They were my own. I wasn't the smiling, accommodating woman from the photograph anymore. I was someone else. Someone who was fighting for her own life. The cost was high, but for the first time, I felt a quiet, thrilling satisfaction in asserting my own needs. I was paying the price for freedom, and I was discovering, to my own astonishment, that I was willing to pay it. The void left by the cessation of my family duties was, at first, a gaping chasm. My days, once crammed with the needs of others, were now vast and empty. The silence that I had begun to savor could, at times, tip over into a deafening roar of loneliness. The pushback from Sarah and Mark had left me feeling bruised and isolated. There were moments when the temptation to retreat, to surrender to the old ways just to reclaim the familiar warmth of their approval, was almost overwhelming. But I held fast to the image of my small, colorful flower bed. It was a tangible reminder of what could grow in a space that I claimed for myself. I knew I had to fill the void not with distractions, but with substance. I had to rediscover the woman who existed before she became the wife and mother, the girl who had her own dreams. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, driven by a restless energy, I went up to the attic. It was a dusty repository of forgotten things, holiday decorations, old baby clothes, Tom's golf clubs. In the far corner, under a yellowed sheet, was a relic from a past life, my easel. Next to it was a wooden box containing dried-up tubes of oil paint and a few stiff, brittle brushes. I had loved to paint in college. I wasn't brilliant, but I was passionate. I loved the smell of the turpentine, the feel of the thick paint on the canvas, the magic of creating a world out of color and light. I had set it all aside when Sarah was born. There was never enough time, never enough space. Someday, I had always told myself. Someday, when the kids are grown. Well, they were grown. Someday was now. I brought the easel downstairs and set it up in the spare bedroom, the one with the best morning light. I threw open the windows, letting the damp, earthy smell of the rain fill the room. I went to the art supply store and, feeling a thrill of decadent self-indulgence, bought a whole new set of paints, fresh canvases, and a variety of soft new brushes. My first attempt was a disaster. I tried to paint the single rose from my garden, but my hand felt clumsy, disconnected from my eye. The colors were muddy, the petals looked like formless blobs. Frustration welled up in me. The critical voices started their chorus, "You've lost it. You can't do this. Who do you think you are?" I almost gave up. I almost packed it all away again. But then I looked at my hands, stained with cadmium red and ultramarine blue. And I smiled. I wasn't trying to create a masterpiece for a gallery. I was just playing. I was making a mess. I was doing something for the pure, simple joy of it. So I kept at it. I painted every day. I painted simple things, a bowl of fruit on the kitchen table, the view from my window, my own reflection in the toaster. Most of it was bad. But slowly, painstakingly, something began to shift. My hand started to remember its old cunning. I learned to mix colors again, to see the way light and shadow played on a surface. I wasn't just painting objects, I was learning to see the world again, with an artist's eyes, noticing the subtle shades of gray in a cloud, the vibrant green of new leaves, the complex beauty in the ordinary. The spare room transformed. It became my studio. It smelled of linseed oil and fresh paint. Canvases, in various states of completion, leaned against the walls. It was my space, a world of my own making. My rediscovery didn't stop with painting. I started reading again. Not just the latest bestsellers, but the classics I'd always meant to get to. I sat in my garden, which was now thriving under my dedicated care, and lost myself in the worlds of Tolstoy and Wharton. I joined the local library and felt a sense of homecoming as I walked through the quiet stacks. One afternoon, while browsing the community bulletin board at the library, I saw a flyer for a weekly open art studio at the local community center. It wasn't a class, just a shared space for people to come and work on their own projects. The thought of showing my clumsy paintings to strangers was terrifying. It was one thing to be an artist in the privacy of my own home, it was another to expose my fragile, new identity to the world. But the loneliness was biting at my heels that day. I needed to be around people. Not my family, with their heavy baggage of expectation, but strangers. With my heart pounding, I packed a small canvas and my paints and drove to the center. I walked into a large, bright room filled with people of all ages, all focused on their own work. The atmosphere wasn't intimidating, it was companionable. An older gentleman was meticulously painting a watercolor landscape. A young woman was sketching furiously in a charcoal pad. I found an empty corner and set up my easel. For the first hour, I was too self-conscious to do much more than dab aimlessly at my canvas. But then, a woman with a shock of silver hair and paint-smeared glasses paused behind me. "That's a lovely composition," she said, her voice warm. "The way you've captured the light on that teacup is just wonderful." I felt a blush creep up my neck. "Oh, it's nothing," I stammered. "I'm just getting back into it." "Well, keep at it," she said with a smile. "You've got a good eye." Her name was Carol. She was a retired art teacher, and her kindness was like water on parched earth. We chatted for a bit, about paints and brushes and the challenges of perspective. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I had a conversation that wasn't about my children, my grandchildren, or the state of my health. It was about a shared passion. Walking out of the community center that evening, I felt a sense of liberation that was different from the one I'd felt in my garden. This wasn't just about freedom from obligation. It was about freedom to connect, to be seen not as a role, but as a person. Lynn, the artist. Lynn, the reader. Lynn, the gardener. The different facets of my identity, long suppressed and forgotten, were beginning to catch the light. I was becoming a person again, and it was a slow, sometimes frightening, but deeply exhilarating process. The house was still quiet, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the vibrant, messy, colorful evidence of my own life, taking shape one brushstroke at a time. The confidence I gained from my solitary pursuits began to seep into other areas of my life, like ink spreading on paper. Setting boundaries with my children had been a seismic event, a terrifying leap into the unknown. But having survived it, I found that smaller acts of self-advocacy became surprisingly manageable. It was like exercising a muscle. The more I used it, the stronger it became. My next-door neighbor, Brenda, was a kind but chronically demanding woman who had long viewed me as her personal overflow valve. For years, I had been the default recipient of her mail when she was on vacation, the emergency contact for her plumber, the person she'd call in a panic when she ran out of sugar. One Saturday morning, she knocked on my door, a frantic look on her face. "Lynn, thank goodness you're home. I'm in a terrible bind. My book club is coming over in an hour, and I completely forgot to pick up a dessert. Could you possibly whip up one of your famous apple crisps for me? You're a lifesaver." The old Lynn would have already been reaching for the flour and butter, my own Saturday plans dissolving without a second thought. The new Lynn smiled politely. "Oh, Brenda, that does sound like a bind," I said, my tone sympathetic but firm. "Unfortunately, I can't help you out. I have plans this morning." My plan, in fact, was to sit in my garden and read. But it was my plan, and it was valid. Brenda's face fell. She looked as flustered as my children had. "Oh. But it wouldn't take you long. You're so good at it." "I'm afraid it's just not possible today," I reiterated, without apology or a lengthy explanation. "There's a wonderful bakery on Main Street, though. I'm sure they'd have something lovely." She left looking deflated, and I felt a familiar twinge of guilt. But it was fleeting, quickly replaced by a sense of quiet pride. I hadn't been unkind. I had simply protected my time. It was another small victory, another brick in the foundation of my new life. My most significant new relationship was the one I forged with Carol, the woman from the art studio. We started getting coffee after our weekly sessions. Our conversations were a revelation. Carol was a widow, like me, but her approach to life was entirely different. She traveled, took classes, had a wide circle of friends, and spoke about her grown children with affection but also with a healthy detachment. "They have their own lives," she said one afternoon, as we sat in a bustling cafe. "And I have mine. We intersect, joyfully, but we are not enmeshed. It's healthier for everyone." She saw me. Not Sarah and Mark's mom, but Lynn. She would look at my latest painting and offer thoughtful critiques, celebrating my progress. She'd recommend books and foreign films. She listened, really listened, when I talked about my struggles with my family, not with pity, but with a knowing empathy. "They're grieving," she said once, a perspective that had never occurred to me. "Grieving? I'm the one who's here." "They haven't lost me," I said. "They've lost the mother they thought they had," she clarified. "The one who existed solely for them. They're grieving the loss of an idea, an arrangement that was very comfortable for them. They'll have to adjust. They'll have to get to know the new you." Her words gave me a framework for understanding their reactions, moving me from a place of hurt to a place of observation. It was through my friendship with Carol that I realized how starved I had been for a relationship of equals, one based on shared interests and mutual respect, not on obligation and history. After several months of this new life, of painting, gardening, reading, and coffee with Carol, the first crack appeared in my children's wall of resentment. I had started a simple social media page, at Carol's suggestion, to post pictures of my garden and my paintings. I didn't expect my family to see it, but of course, my sister Claire, my biggest cheerleader, shared one of my posts. It was a painting I was particularly proud of, a still life of lemons in a blue ceramic bowl, the light from the kitchen window hitting them just so. One evening, the phone rang. It was Sarah. Her tone was different. The cool, defensive edge was gone, replaced by something tentative, almost shy. "Hi, Mom," she said. "Hello, Sarah." There was a long pause. I didn't rush to fill it. I waited. "Aunt Claire. She shared a picture of one of your paintings on her page," she said. "The one with the lemons." "Yes, I saw that," I said neutrally. Another pause. Then, her voice small, she said, "It's really beautiful, Mom. I didn't know you could paint like that." The words hung in the air between us. I didn't know. It was an admission. A confession of her own blindness. It wasn't an apology, not yet. But it was an opening. It was the first time she had seen a piece of me, the real me, and acknowledged it. "Thank you, Sarah," I said, my voice soft. "I'm enjoying it very much." "Yeah," she said, and I could hear a smile in her voice, faint and fragile. "I can see that." It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a magical fix. But it was a start. It was a flicker of light in the long, dark tunnel of our estrangement. She hadn't called to ask for something, or to complain that I wasn't providing something. She had called to offer something, a simple, honest compliment. She had seen a glimpse of the woman I was becoming, and for the first time, she seemed not threatened by it, but intrigued. The ground, which had been so hard and frozen, felt like it was finally beginning to thaw. The thaw was slow, almost imperceptible at first, like the very beginning of spring after a long, hard winter. The phone call from Sarah about my painting was followed by weeks of relative silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It felt less like a punishment and more like a period of contemplation. I continued with my new life, pouring my energy into my art, my garden, and my friendships. I was building a life so full and satisfying on its own terms that the outcome with my children, while still important, no longer held the power to define my happiness. Then, one Saturday, Mark showed up at my door. He was alone, and he looked tired. He held a small, potted orchid, almost identical to the one Sarah had brought as a weapon weeks ago. This one, however, felt different. "Can I come in?" he asked, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. He walked into the kitchen and placed the orchid on the table, right where Sarah's had been. He stood there for a moment, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. My latest canvas was on a small easel in the corner, a landscape of the park by the river. "Sarah was right," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the painting. "You're really good." He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw not a petulant man-child, but my son, looking lost and uncertain. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry." The words, so simple, so long-awaited, landed with gentle force. "I've been a jerk," he continued, finally looking at me. "All those years. Asking you for money. I never even thought about what it meant for you. I just assumed. Assumed you had it, assumed you'd give it. I treated you like a bank, not like my mom. It was easier than facing my own screw-ups." He took a shaky breath. "And when you said no, I got so angry. But the truth is, I wasn't angry at you. I was angry at myself. And I was scared. Scared that I couldn't do it on my own. You've spent my whole life making me believe I couldn't fail, and I guess I started to believe it, too." Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them back. This wasn't a moment for my tears, it was a moment for his truth. "It took you doing all this," he gestured vaguely around the room, at the painting, at the vibrant flowers visible through the window, "for me to see it. You built a whole new life for yourself. And I realized I had to build my own, for real this time." He told me he had taken on a part-time job on weekends to stabilize his finances. He had created a strict budget. He was, for the first time, standing on his own 2 feet without my safety net. He wasn't just apologizing, he was showing me he had changed. Our healing began that day. It wasn't a return to the old ways. The dynamic had been irrevocably altered. A few weeks later, Sarah called. "Mark told me he came to see you," she said, her voice soft. "He said you guys had a good talk." "We did," I confirmed. "I'm sorry, too, Mom," she whispered into the phone. "I miss you. The kids miss you. But I get it now. I think I do. We just saw you as Mom. We forgot you were Lynn. We took all the giving for granted because we never saw the cost to you." The dam of my own emotions finally broke, and I let a few quiet tears fall. "I miss you too, sweetie. So much." Could we try again?" she asked, her voice hopeful. Not like before. But something new. Maybe we could come over next Sunday? Not for a big dinner. Just to visit. We could bring pizza. Or we could all help you in the garden." The offer was revolutionary. We could bring pizza. We could help you. It was an offer of participation, not expectation. It was an acknowledgement of my life, my interests. "I would love that," I said, and my heart felt lighter than it had in years. That Sunday was different. They arrived not with the entitlement of house guests, but with the tentative respect of visitors entering a new and cherished space. Sarah brought a stack of pizzas, and David, her husband, who had always been a polite but distant presence, actually asked to see my studio. He looked at my paintings with genuine interest, asking questions about my technique. Mark showed up with his own gardening gloves. He spent an hour with me, digging and weeding, asking me the names of the different plants. The grandchildren, Emily and Josh, were just happy to be there, to have my focused, joyful attention without the chaotic backdrop of a huge family meal. We ate pizza on paper plates in the backyard, surrounded by the thriving garden I had built. The conversation was different. They asked me questions. They asked about my art, about my friend Carol, about what book I was reading. They told me about their lives, but it wasn't a monologue of complaints, it was a sharing of experiences. I learned that day that setting boundaries wasn't about pushing my children away. It was about creating the necessary space for them to see me clearly. By reclaiming my own life, I hadn't abandoned them. I had, in fact, given them a gift, the chance to have a relationship with their mother as a whole person, not just a set of functions. The healing wasn't complete, it was a process, a new dance we were all learning the steps to. But for the first time, we were dancing to the same music, a melody of mutual respect and a deeper, more honest love. Today, my life is a tapestry woven with threads of peace, purpose, and self-respect. The silence in my house is no longer a weight, it is a canvas. Some days, it's filled with the quiet scratch of a paintbrush on canvas or the rustle of pages as I turn a book in my sun-drenched garden. Other days, it's filled with the easy laughter of my friend Carol as we drink coffee in my kitchen, or the new, more respectful cadence of my children's voices. The Sunday dinners have returned, but in a new form. They are potlucks now, a collaborative effort. Mark brings a salad from his own small vegetable garden, which he started after helping me with mine. Sarah and David bring a main course, and the kids are in charge of dessert, usually a wonderfully messy, homemade concoction. I no longer spend the entire day cooking and cleaning. I participate. I enjoy. The burden has been replaced by a shared joy. My relationship with my children has been rebuilt on a foundation of honesty. The loans to Mark have stopped entirely. Instead, he calls me for advice, for encouragement, a far more valuable currency. Sarah and I talk on the phone more often than we used to, but our conversations are different. She tells me about her work challenges, and I listen, but I also tell her about my frustrations with a tricky watercolor or my excitement about a new exhibition at the local museum. We are two women, sharing our lives, not just a mother absorbing her daughter's stress. I have continued to paint, and my confidence has grown with every canvas. I even sold a small piece at a local art fair, a moment of validation so pure and sweet it brought tears to my eyes. The $25 I made was more precious to me than any of the thousands I had loaned away, because it was mine. I had earned it through my own passion and work. I often think about that photograph that used to sit on my kitchen table, the one of the younger, smiling me with my arms wrapped around my children. I keep it in a photo album now, a cherished memory of a specific time. But the person I am today would not fit in that picture. That woman's happiness was entirely reflected in the smiles of others. My happiness now is a light that shines from within. The final, most profound realization of my journey came to me a few weeks ago. I was walking through my garden in the early morning, the dew still clinging to the petals of my now famous roses. I was admiring their resilience, their beauty, their quiet strength. And it struck me that true freedom had not come from my children changing their behavior. Their change was a welcome and wonderful consequence, but it wasn't the source of my peace. My freedom came the moment I gave myself permission to have needs. It came when I decided that my well-being was not a luxury to be attended to after everyone else was satisfied, but an absolute necessity. It came when I realized that saying no to them was a way of saying yes to myself. The accident that set this all in motion, that hollow feeling in my kitchen, that dismissive voicemail, was not a tragedy. It was a gift. It was the universe, in its own clumsy way, knocking on my door to tell me it was time to wake up. I am 65 years old. For much of my life, I believed my value lay in how much I could give away. Now I know that my true value lies in the life I cultivate for myself. By setting boundaries, by reclaiming my time and my passions, by choosing to love myself as fiercely as I loved my family, I did not lose them. I found myself. And in doing so, I created a life that is authentically, peacefully, and joyfully mine to live. The silence in my house is no longer a void. It is a space filled with possibility. And it is a beautiful sound.